All right, great. Welcome back to the second session of today's workshop. Our theme for the next hour and a half is institutional solutions. I hope you'll hear some. My name is David Graywall, and this is a mini public, which is actually, to take a leaf out of Rahul's book, a decent hierarchical mini public. I am the hierarch and I'm decent. And what this means is that I will follow the organizers' request to be very strict with these citizens. They will each get 12 minutes, no more. I will knock loudly at 10 minutes, and again when their time is up. This is so that we can have a Q&A. I will be no less strict with you in the Q&A. Long questions that suggest that you've done extensive reading are not welcome. We'll begin with Robert Post. He teaches at the Yale Law School. We'll then move on to Arash Abizadeh, who teaches at McGill. We'll then hear from Isabelle Ferreras, who joins us from Louvain. And then we'll finalize, we'll end with Jeffrey Green from Penn, and I'll offer some brief remarks of my own, keeping my own decent hierarchically policed self to 12 minutes as well. Robert?
So do you have a speak from here?
We do. Is that easier?
Yeah. All right, so we talked yesterday about the hierarchy between political scientists and political theorists. I confess I'm just a lawyer, so at the bottom of the heap. It's appropriate that I'm put on the panel for institutional solutions. What lawyers do is we sort of say, what's to be done? You know, what are we actually going to do about this? What kind of institutions are we going to create? But that does make us, in Ellen's phrase at the outset of this conference, irredeemably normative. Like, what is it that we want to do? And so, in this conference, we're talking about the crisis of democracy, and you can't make a solution to something unless you know what the problem is you want to solve. This goes to some of the questions that were just asked in the panel this morning. So what do we mean by the democracy whose crisis we want to solve? And I'm going to speak about democracy. This is not cutting nature at their joints. This is merely sort of saying, this is the sense of democracy in which I'm going to take it. It's not an arbitrary sense. It's the sense which is at the core of American constitutional structure and governance. So, but it's also, I would say, at the core of the notion of democracy since the Enlightenment, and it's the sense which Bobbio puts it when he says democracy, quoting him, begins with the distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. Democratic forms of government are those in which the laws are made by the same people to whom they apply, and for that reason are autonomous norms, while in autocratic forms of government, the lawmakers are different from those to whom the laws are addressed and are therefore heteronomous norms. And in American constitutional structure, this is cashed out in Frank Michelman's well-known assertion that self-rule, the belief that the American people are politically free insofar as they are governed by themselves collectively, is at the root of our notion of self-determination, at the root of our notion of self-governance. So the problem I'm going to take to look at is what are institutional solutions to the problem of democracy, understood as self-rule, the Enlightenment project of autonomy, taking command of our own fate. And the minute I frame the problem that way, of course, there's an issue of what do we mean by self-rule? I mean, even if we take that very narrow definition of democracy, and I'm going to put on the table three different distinctions, three different puzzles about what it means to engage in self-rule that one needs to have a position on in order to have solutions, and show you a little bit about how different solutions will follow from different understandings of each of these distinctions. So the first distinction might be, what do we mean by self-rule? Do we mean collective preference satisfaction? As if democracy were a market, and democracy is the form of government which most collectively satisfies the wishes, the desires, the wants of the people who are ruling themselves? Or do we mean by self-rule a collective, what Urbanati might call judgment, a decision that's made with reflection and with reason? And these are very different concepts of what it means to rule yourself, to engage in reason or to engage in preference maximization. So if we imagine democracy as a kind of marketplace, transparently connected to the desires and wants of the people who are ruling themselves, then our institutional solutions will be to remove every institution which distorts the wants, desires, wishes of the population which is ruling itself. We want a pure expression of the pure will of the population. So we want to get rid of the United States Senate. We want to get rid of political parties. We want to get rid of the filibuster. We want to get rid of the electoral college. We want to get rid of checks and balances. Anything that distorts the ability of this population, as in a frictionless market, to express itself. And so that would be the way in which we would start to move in terms of institutional solutions. We use words like transparency. We use words like failure, distortion. We want to get rid of distortions of the will. We probably wouldn't have a first past the post electoral districts. We might want to move toward PR or parliamentary system and so forth and so on. That would be the way we would imagine solutions. On the other hand, suppose we imagine democratic self-governance as a process of collective deliberation or conversation in which we are coming to a collective judgment. And imagine that we have certain temporal understandings of judgment. It takes a while to reach a judgment. It takes clarification. It takes the ability to think through the views of the others, to engage them, and so forth. Then we're going to have a different set of solutions. This was certainly the way, I would say, the framers of the American Constitution imagined. They wouldn't use the word democratic self-governance. They thought democracy was terrible because it was too transparent to the wishes, desires, the inflamed passions of the public. But recall in Ferreras 63, Madison is celebrating the creation of a form of government that involves, I'm quoting him now, the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. Right? But you have checks and balances precisely in order to create forms of temporal extension that allows for the exercise of reason and judgment. But just to give you a simple contemporary example, judges entrench present understandings of the law. Law is a necessary concomitant of any democracy. Do we want judges who reflect the present will, using the word advisedly, will of the public, which means we get movement judges like Scalia and Thomas, or on the other hand, movement judges like Hugo Black or William Douglas, or do we want to entrench forms of judges who reflect our better judgment, Philip Sober of the American people, in which case we would, on the one hand, have a filibuster rule or a supermajority rule for the confirmation of judges, or we don't. We want a majoritarian rule because it's more transparent to the. I mean, that's just a simple institutional question that would depend upon our understanding of the nature of the kind of democracy whose crisis we want to solve. Now, the second set of distinctions goes to this. Is democracy about collective decision-making, or is it about collective authorship or identification? There's a big difference between these two, and we often lose sight of the difference between these two. Simple example might illustrate it. Suppose you have a form of government where you wake up and there's a computer by your bed, and every decision to be decided is decided by your flipping, making a vote on the computer. Computer will give you whatever information you want, including what the polling data is, what everyone else thinks. But the condition is you can't talk to anybody else about what decision you want. You just have to decide it based on whatever information the computer gives you. And if you think that's a crazy condition, remember Rousseau says the general will happens when you don't talk to anybody else, right? So is that, and that's decision making, but that is not, that's not identification, because you're as likely to imagine the collective decision making in such circumstances as an imposition, as a heteronymous decision, as you are as an exercise of collective self-determination. So if we imagine that democracy is about collective decision making, then our efforts to solve the present crisis will be to clarify forms of decision making, and we want the people to decide things. We don't want other people deciding things for the people. So we'll probably have more referenda and more initiatives, and we probably have more direct primaries, or we'd get rid of political parties altogether, and we'd have nonpartisan forms of government, and we probably would get rid of forms of aggregation of voters, as in geographical districts or states or cities or whatever. But if we imagine that the form of that democracy is a matter of we govern ourselves because we think that the state is we identify with the state speaks for us, it's responsive to us, authorship is the primary concept, then we're going to need to inquire into the mechanisms by which such authorship are created. You know, if the state keeps making incompetent decisions, or decisions which screw us, then we're not likely to identify with it, to go to the point that David Graywall was making last night at dinner. But I think the point that was made in the last panel, also it's the case that if everyone that disagrees with us is an enemy, in Schmittian sense of enemy, we're not very likely to be able to engender a collective sense of authorship. So how we engage the other, the mechanisms by which a collective sense of authorship in the face of inevitable disagreement and controversy, these would be the kinds of things that we would look at in the First Amendment constitutional order. That means we would look at issues of First Amendment freedom of speech and the public sphere in which public opinion is formed. We look at opinion bubbles, we look at social media, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go into that more. And the third distinction I want to put on the table in the last 2.5 minutes, I'm not sure I have a handle on this distinction, so I appreciate your clarification, but is how do we conceive a demos that governs itself? Do we conceive it as consisting of persons who have particular interests versus persons who only have universal interests? So sometimes this distinction takes on geographical form. The demos is people arbitrarily within a geographical district, either in or out within the jurisdiction, you can say, in law, or it could be the people who are affected by a government decision versus not affected. There's an in-out. Sometimes we say it has to be people who have a particular interest, as in they identify with the form of government which is going to govern them, so ethnic identification or racial identification, and Habermas speaks against that with the idea of constitutional patriotism and so forth. But there's another question here, which is, more generally, one would ask this question by saying, is a person in the demos someone with particular interests, as in I'm a debtor or a creditor, or is a member of the demos someone who is understood only to speak for universal interests, the public good? So the framers imagine a form of government in which the people govern themselves out of their respective particular interests. There was no distinction between somebody as a citizen and somebody who was a creditor. And the form of government was created to create a sense of self-government among those people who had particular interests. Sometime around Jacksonian period, the people began to be written with a capital P and democracy with a capital D, and we lost that. Our own framing comes out of the progressive era, where we contrast the special interest to the public interest. Of course, we don't really know what the public interest is. Sometimes it's deontological in the sense of human rights. Sometimes it's welfarist. We have very different accounts of the public interest. But whatever it is, it's universalized. And citizens are supposed to speak from this universalized interest if they're really citizens, as opposed to speaking from actually the interest that they have as particular persons and having particular interests. And how do we imagine constructing, is that the end? That's so just think about that with the question of partisan gerrymandering, and how one imagines solving the institutional puzzle of partisan gerrymandering in light of this notion of the interests of the person who constitute the dean.
Even as a decent hierarch, it's hard to discipline one's former dean. Arash.
Maybe I'll sit here. Whatever's more comfortable. All right, so what I would like to do here is to defend a kind of institutional compromise with what I take to be competing values and norms that underwrite representative democracy. And I'm just going to give you a list. In some ways, I agree with Rahul that there is a set of multiple values that are at stake in political life. And I think that democracy serves or is justifiable with reference to its service to these particular values and goods. So I'm going to give you a list of things. One is peaceful conflict resolution. The other is the satisfactory responsiveness to interests. Third is agency, which I take to be opportunities for influence and participation in the political process. Fourth, impartial resolution of conflicts of interest and disagreement. And fifth, political equality. So and notice that I did not include something like self-rule or self-legislation, which I think was the themes you were talking, because I think that's sort of part of the mythology, particularly of various democratic ideologies that I think we can talk about, but I just don't think that's part of the story. So let me give you a sense of what I think competitive electoral representative democracies are able to do in relation to these 5 criteria and what they're not able to do. And I think what they're not able to do is quite a bit. So let's start with political equality. I think as Bernard Manin has taught us, that elections are, in some ways, they're capable of respecting the equality of citizens qua voters, but as candidates, they are in fact not capable of doing this because, well, one thing is that voters, when they're trying to select candidates, can engage in various kinds of discrimination, which means that nobody actually, not only do we not, as candidates, have equal prospects for success, we don't even have equal opportunity for success. Another thing that is important is that on his account, which many of you will be familiar with, is that resources are required to win elections, and those resources are unequally available to the various candidates, which leads to another form of inequality and what it leads to effectively is elite chambers that are biased in favor of elite interests. So as far as political equality is concerned, electoral representative democracy is not very good. So that's one thing to notice. Secondly, impartial resolution of conflict, partly as a result of the fact that it leads to these kinds of elite representative institutions. They're electoral representative democratic institutions are not a good way to instantiate impartial resolution of conflicts of interest or disagreements because the chambers that are produced by this mechanism will not reflect the variety of interests and views that in an unbiased fashion. So that's another. We know that elections are susceptible to manipulation and domination by powerful interests, and by and large end up producing representatives that favor the interests of the powerful. And this is obviously exacerbated by the levels of voter ignorance, for example, that makes them susceptible to manipulation by those with the resources to do it. So those two not happening. There's one that's a bit complicated, and this is responsiveness to interests. And here, I think that the view that representative democracy could be responsive in a satisfactory way to people's interests really hinges on 2 premises. One is that it's capable of responding to the expressed opinions and preferences of people. That's the first premise. And the second is that these are reliable guides to their interests. And what I want to focus on is the first premise in particular. The mechanisms by which this is supposed to happen, there are 2 main mechanisms. One is the selection and one is the sanctioning mechanism. The selection mechanism is that it's supposed to be a way in which you select for representatives that inherently are disposed some way to be responsive to the interests of people. So you don't need inducements, external inducement. This might be, for example, you select people that have made you select people prospectively who have made promises that they're going to carry through on. But the problem with this is that representatives have discretion; they don't have to keep their promises. So this is not going to work. The other is the retrospective, which is that you look back to their record in the past and you vote retrospectively for those people that you think are going to carry out a program that's in your interest. Aiken and Bartels, in their book, they argue that this isn't really happening because what in fact happens is the reverse, that people identify with a party and then come to form their policy preferences on the basis of that identification rather than the other way around. That's a powerful argument, though I have a quibble with it that I think is going to be relevant for the point that I want to make in a moment. The other mechanism, sanctioning. In other words, voters retrospectively punish failures to respond to their interests, and officials anticipate this retrospective sanction, and so they are induced to act in some way in a responsive fashion to track people's interests. Again, Aiken and Bartels argue that because of voter ignorance, that they can't, it's very difficult, for example, to tell what outcomes politicians are responsible for, and if you can't tell, then it's hard actually to punish them for in a way that is an effective incentive to induce them to act. So there's a kind of blind retrospection that people engage in, or in the case of economic responsiveness, it's a kind of myopic retrospective, and which is basically random on their view. Okay, so largely on this argument, it fails to be responsive. A couple of things I want to say. I don't think it's quite as bad as Aiken and Bartel's make it seem. First is that selection, and this has to do, I think, with what Susan Stokes was saying earlier. As far as the selection mechanism is concerned, it's quite plausible to think that party identification in some ways may actually be a reliable heuristic for tracking your interests broadly understood. In other words, there's a kind of cognitive dimension to this. So it's not as if African Americans first identify with the Democratic Party and then decide, oh, well, you know, we'd like to have less racist policies, right? It's the other way around on some fundamental issues. Aiken and Bartels recognize this, for example, in the case of abortion and women's relationship to that policy issue. But that's an important concession, I think, to see, because it's not as minimal as I think maybe the story there tells us. And the other is sanctioning. Some policies, it's actually quite clear who's responsible. So economic policies, maybe not, but, you know, policies that are values, for example, gay marriage or gun laws, abortion, and so on, it's quite possible to see who's responsible for what kind of outcomes, and people, I think, by and large, know this. So, in other words, what I would conclude by this kind of survey is that as far as responsiveness is concerned, electoral mechanisms are not that great, but they're not nothing either. Right? And so that's one important thing that I want to say. It's not nothing either. Okay, so what do they really do? They don't do the first two, political equality and impartiality. Responsiveness, you know, it's coarse. As far as peaceful conflict resolution, I think this is really where the rubber hits the road, by providing a future prospect for losers to mobilize and through their own agency to be able to seize power in the future. This raises the opportunity cost for them of engaging in civil war. So I think that's a very good thing about elections. This is basically Schwartzky's argument. And the second is agency. Precisely because elections aren't nothing, and that's why it was important for me to say this, they incentivize the mobilization of political actors. They incentivize participation, a contestatory culture, and the public articulation of interests and demands. So I think that's a very important feature of electoral democracy. But what we should recognize is that some of the very important values that they're supposed to serve, they fundamentally fail on. And so I think here, in the sort of positive contribution of the paper, I turn to a potential institutional arrangement that could supplement these electoral mechanisms to sort of serve the ones that aren't being served very well, namely impartiality and political equality. And this is sortition. So I'm arguing that this actually provides us with another kind of argument for bicameral legislatures as a kind of institutional compromise, because what sortition is capable of doing is, first of all, serving political equality, because precisely each individual, qua candidate, has equal prospects for success in being selected as a candidate. We are simply, the prospects are precisely based on the quality that we all share in common as citizens, rather than something that distinguishes us from each other. And also that it is impartial, at least at the stage of selecting representatives, because it's invulnerable to manipulation and influence through the use of resources, if it's truly random. Okay, so that's the, and the upshot is that it doesn't produce an elite chamber the way that elections do, but that one that is much more representative of the interests of the less powerful in society. So it serves these two, and it enhances the responsiveness of the legislative institutions. Why? Because of its reliance not on a sanctioning mechanism, not on the accountability mechanism, but through a selection mechanism. Precisely because random selection will tend to produce a chamber that is more descriptively representative of the population than an elected one. It serves to enhance the responsiveness to those kinds of interests that would be less represented in a elected chamber. in the sense that you're selecting for people who are more inclined to, first of all, have perspectives and views that are in tune with those interests and that actually have those interests themselves, because they mirror them in some way. What is lacking here, though, obviously, is that there is no accountability mechanism that is intrinsic to sortition itself. You can add accountability mechanisms to it, but in and of itself, it's not a mechanism for accountability, and therefore it does not provide opportunities in and of itself for political agency, and therefore the incentivization of mobilization and so on. And also, it's not a way, I mean, if you only had sortition, it would be a recipe for civil war, basically, because there's no mechanism for losers to feel that they can act politically to seize power in the future. So this is what I take to be a way of reaching an institutional compromise, because I actually don't think that there is a way of serving all of these through the same kinds of mechanisms. And so I guess I'll end there by saying that one of the questions that is often raised about sortition chambers, which I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, is about the potential competence issues of sortition chambers. I think that's one of the most important questions to be raised. But there's various kinds of institutional remedies that I think are available to deal with those issues.
Thank you. So now we have Isabelle, who is going to speak for 5 minutes and then run a 6-minute trailer, coming in safely under time.
Or the opposite, actually.
Okay. Great. Should we move for the trailer or not? Maybe. Yeah. So maybe.
No, I'm going to start with speaking. So
okay. Oh, okay. All right. Great. So I'll knock at 5 minutes then, just so you have a sense.
Yes.
Great.
Oh, I guess I should take the microphone over there. Okay. Perfect. Sorry. Okay, well, good morning. I'm coming from to this discussion for a very different background, mostly ethnographic research on the life of working people in the Western service-based economies and critical social sciences. So what's basically sociological research in the area of work has consistently been showing is that people have high expectation with regard to having a say in the conduct of their life at work and around work. And this is what I call the critical intuition of democratic justice. So this is, from my perspective, not a crisis of democracy that we are experiencing today, but with people voting for the not or the unusual suspects. Rather, it signals a hunger of democracy, and this has been touched yesterday by Arent, by Philip. And the problem, I guess, lies with the very features of our political democracy as we know it today, which does very little to address, to provide people access to self-government, and to start with our own conception of the domain of life concerned with the idea of self-government itself. So the area of life where this hunger for democracy is the most felt, I see from my research, is the work life. And I'm sorry to have to report this shocking news that workers, indeed, in their work life are not citizens. On an everyday basis, people experience what I think we should call the contradiction between capitalism and democracy. So between the democratic promise and capitalism, between the recognition of having all an equal say on the government of our own life and future, and a government of a very important sphere of life which is reserved to a particular minority, those who own capital and who invest capital in that area of life. So if we read the capitalist government of the firm as a political regime, it is clear that this is a despotic regime in Aristotle's sense, who viewed the ideal type of despotic relationship in the master-slave relationship. And capitalist despotism is a regime that grants all political rights to capital investors only. And people live in that world. So what they've come to nurture high expectations toward democracy and their ability to wait on the decisions that affect their own life, they experience on an everyday basis that some people are more equals than others, to quote George Orwell. And if you factor in globalization, new technology, and the superpower gained by globally mobile capital, you understand that this contradiction is reaching a climax. And it seems this situation has indeed reduced the political democratic promise to a kind of ridiculous dwarf. And citizens are taking notice. As a consequence, anti-establishment resentment is on the rise, and the threat of populist, authoritarian or illiberal regimes is looming in a very real way in our very own countries. Indeed, faced with a contradiction, basically you can go both ways. So we do have a choice. Either you promote more despotism from a minority in this part of the political realm that we conventionally call the economy, with the spillover effect that it is going to have and that we're seeing now on political democracy, or you shift courses and start extending again democracy in the economy, to speak like Eric Ollingwright of deepening and extending democracy. So to put things in a more optimistic light, if we are faced with a crisis of democracy today, it must be, as we say in French, a crise de croissance, a crisis of growth, to speak for the positive outcome that a difficult passage can produce. And I feel very humbled and happy to address this issue in the alma mater of the great Robert Dahl. Now, to enter into this perspective, you obviously need to make a few conceptual adjustments with the liberal traditions. The economy becomes part of the larger set of political relations, and the firm has to be eventually recognized for what it is, a system of power that needs careful characterization, and I suggest a political entity. So what is the corporation? The corporation, we know perfectly what it is. Legal scholars tell us that the corporation is the legal structuring of capital investment. What is a firm? This is totally undefined yet today. And this is my suggestion. It is time to enter into a reconstructive, institutionalist perspective on the firm to make it possible to recognize that the firm, beyond and encompassing the corporation, that particular legal structuring of capital investment, is a political entity in and of itself that is in need of being democratized. So I'm going to then watch this trailer with you, because it's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you what you've just finished, to speak for the proposition that a new book that I just published is making, which very nicely fits with my previous co-panelists. And thank you for the amazing graduate students who are working hard all the time to make us. Yes, she started at the beginning.
Democracy is just what we expect when we wake up in the morning. We expect to be treated as citizens with basic rights and responsibilities, and we like it that way. At the same time, though, large companies and corporations now rule the global economy in very questionable ways in terms of human rights, civil liberties, and the environment. In fact, democracy itself has been disrupted by capitalism, to the point that it's perilously close to extinction. A new book by Isabelle Ferreras called Firms as Political Entities, Saving Democracy Through Economic Bicameralism, published by Cambridge University Press, proposes a simple yet revolutionary solution: democratizing capitalism. So how exactly would this work? Well, let's start by taking a look at the context. For generations, workers have been viewed as one production factor among many. That's why we call them human resources or human capital. And firms have been viewed as private economic organizations. But employees are also citizens, and they come to work with an expectation of democratic justice. In other words, that they will be treated in the workplace as the citizens they are in the rest of their lives. Here's the thing. While our societies have evolved, becoming more and more democratic, for the most part, the firms we work in, which affect and shape those societies, have not. A firm's capital investors are its only members to have a voice in the major decisions affecting its future, and the future of the communities in which that firm functions. But what about the labor investors? Although structures do exist to help their voices be heard, they do not have equal say in the government of firms. In other words, in the government of a major part of their own lives and futures. So what's the solution? Well, if we look back through history at democracies through the ages, as far back as Roman antiquity, we can observe that they all passed through what we'll call a bicameral moment, when, for society to continue functioning, those in power understood that their only option was to share that power or lose it altogether. In this way, the Roman patricians were forced to grant tribunes to the plebs. England saw itself obliged to establish a House of Commons alongside the House of Lords. And the United States of America set up a representative system to balance state and federal powers. Corporations today are in a situation that demands the same kind of transition. Currently, they're governed by boards of directors, much as if England were governed by a single property-owning House of Lords and nothing else. It's time for them to undertake a bicameral moment of their own and institute what we call economic bicameralism. By establishing a labor investors' House of Representatives alongside a capital investors' House of Representatives, what's currently known as the Board of Directors, economic bicameralism grants the same rights to workers, firms' labor investors, as the ones held by capital investors, creating a system of parliamentary governance in which a majority of representatives in both houses is required to elect executive management and ratify major decisions concerning a firm's future. Thus, the bicameral firm would be governed by a unified and representative two-house parliament. Democracies are built on the promise of equality, and the current capitalist economy is breaking that promise. Economic bicameralism opens the door to greater equality of opportunity, of voice, and of hope, offering us a powerful tool to help us to repair our social ladder, improve our workplaces, and protect our planet, while bolstering both our economy and our civil society. The time for transition is now. To find out more or get involved, visit www.firmsaspoliticalentities.net.
Thank you, Isabelle. Did you draw the cartoons?
No,
I kept. All right. Wonderful. So we now have Jeffrey Green, I'll knock at 10 minutes, and then you have 2 minutes
Okay.
left, and I know you'll take the full time, so no problem.
Thank you, and thanks to
Great.
Helen and Shaya for the invitation. I was a student here in the 90s, and I don't remember that many Friday mornings in New Haven from those years, so it's nice to see something new. My remarks here are to suggest two different ways democracy might be in crisis, and to put forward one institutional response in the form of regulation of the most advantaged class. I hate to be too America-centric, because I think that America is by no count the best democracy in the world. It's more lowly ranked than about 20 others, according to numerous indices. And democracy is, of course, a global phenomenon. But I do think that one of the aspects of our sense of crisis, a crisis of decline, comes from the fact that leading liberal democracies in the West, especially the United States, have themselves declined. And as outsized promoters of democracy, their decline spells concern for the rest of the world who cares about democracy. And I know that America's record in democracy promotion has been uneven at best. I think Raoul's pointed out how the spread of democracy for the U.S. has sometimes meant the infliction of a lot of violence. We would also want to point out how sometimes the U.S. has been on the side of overthrowing democracies in the name of dictatorships. I'm thinking of Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Chile from 1973, some of the most egregious examples of that. Nonetheless, I think on balance, especially in recent decades, the U.S. has been a force of democracy promotion in its foreign policy and also as an exemplar. And so when you see various features that represent serious deficits of democracy in the U.S. or declines in its democratic character in the form of increased inequality, plutocracy, voter suppression, lack of representation for the poor, archaic voting systems and increasingly disempowered majorities, and media manipulation, I think you have a sense of crisis for the American democratic regime that spreads to other parts of the world who look to the U.S. for leadership. So what could be done about this crisis? On the one hand, if the U.S. isn't even the top democracy, if it's ranked 21 by the Democracy Index, just do what the top democracies do. There's your answer. Not all questions that are politically urgent are philosophically interesting. And I think that if you were to look to the top democracies, you might see that they make voting registration less onerous, that they have greater campaign finance regulation, and more egalitarian educational systems, among other things. But of course, I think that part of what we experience in the crisis of democracy in the US is that even if we in this room were to agree on all those reforms, there's a pessimism that they would occur anytime soon. And this is, I think, not only because of what I referred to in the contribution as the sad ossification of constitutional structures, which makes structural reform hard to imagine, but I think the growth of what I would refer to as a peculiar corruption among the citizenry, which is losing the will to seek out democratic justice. I refer to this as a peculiar corruption to differentiate it from the more usual discourse about corruption that political thinkers from ancient times through the modern period have discoursed about. Ancients tended to think that you had to have a publicly interested mind and not just care about your private self-interest to have a virtuous and successful popular republic, whereas modern thinkers thought that you could be selfish and you could have a regime that didn't presuppose any overcoming of your selfishness in the name of a kind of common good public spiritedness. And I could cite in that latter regard figures like Hobbes or Hume and his notion of the knave, or Madison and ambition must be made to counteract ambition and so forth. But I think Kant is the most useful here. As many of you will know, Kant writes, the problem of organizing a state, and perhaps especially a republic, however hard it may seem, can be solved even for a race of devils, if only they have what he calls Verstand, if only they have intelligence, understanding, reason. And I think it's that type of corruption that we're experiencing today, not the corruption of selfishness, but the corruption of not being able to sufficiently advocate for your own self-interest. There are many instances of this phenomenon, the long-standing lack of sufficient voting and disengagement, not just being lied to by one's politicians, but growing signs that we're tolerating being lied to, opposing social welfare programs that benefit people, the weird findings of Larry Bartels, and also there's an article in the New York Times from 2017 that the more educated Republicans are more likely to deny that there's climate change and more likely to deny that inequality has increased over the last generation. I think that points to a kind of irrationality. The favoring of lack of civility among our leaders and our parliamentarians. I think of the example from 2009 when Congressman Joe Wilson interrupted President Barack Obama in his State of the Union address. He was rebuked by the House, 240 to 179, but it didn't matter. Within 48 hours, $2 million of donations had poured in, rewarding his own incivility and perhaps showing a kind of spirit of irrationality pervading the culture. At its extreme, it's very scary to be irrational and non-utilitarian. I'm reminded of what Hannah Arendt said, differentiating a mere dictatorship from a totalitarian regime. And one of the differences is a dictatorship is animated by a sense of utilitarian self-interest. Dictators want to amass power and consolidate it, whereas totalitarian regimes have something non-utilitarian and suicidal about themselves. Obviously, we're not at that standpoint, but I think that the growth of this type of devil without understanding is pointing us, it reminds us of that fear. So that's one kind of crisis I examine in my contribution. The other crisis is not the crisis of decline, but the crisis of impossibility. I think that any honest observer about the liberal democratic regime has to admit that we can't quite fulfill the promises of this regime with regard to creating a situation that has fair equality of opportunity in the educational and political systems. I think that even in the most egalitarian regimes of the world, even in a situation of sortition, the socioeconomically advantaged will have disproportionate impact in politics and will have disproportionate opportunities to educate their children. I cite the example of Finland, one of the most egalitarian political and educational systems, where 80% of Finns report that their view, their opinion, that coming from a wealthy family is at least somewhat relevant to getting ahead in life. And I think that this would be the case in even more egalitarian political and economic structures, because at some level we can't fully separate out the economic system from the political system. We can always do better instead of worse. There's a big difference between Finland and the US, but I think we would do well to return to some earlier, more honest meditations about the inevitable overlap of economic and political power. I think of James Harrington from the 1600s, who said, where there is inequality of estates, there must be inequality of power. Or Montesquieu from the 1700s, it is impossible that riches will not secure power. Or Madison in 1821, who referred to what he called the ordinary influence possessed by property, that even when you have universal suffrage, those with property will have a disproportionate, outsized impact. And so I think coming to grips with the, if you like, the traces of feudalism that still infect and darken our liberal democracies is part of going forward in a more progressive way. These two problems, the crisis of decline and the crisis of impossibility, are different, but I think both could be addressed somewhat by spending more attention to regulating the most advantaged class, regulating the most advantaged politically, who in my first book I argued should be forced to appear under conditions they don't control, and regulating the most advantaged economically in the form of a kind of compulsory noblesse oblige. These are of interest because they get beyond representational norms. They are norms of popular empowerment that are not about listening to the specific legislative preferences of a population, but in addition to that, trying to burden the few. They may seem a bit outlandish to some of you, but they actually recall some of the earliest practices of the popular republics of which we have earliest historical record. In Athens, there was the aisphora, or special taxes uniquely levied against the wealthy in times of emergency. There were also liturgies or services owed to the state uniquely by the wealthy or so 100 most families. And of course, ostracism. And Rome had a slightly less formal, less compulsory ethic of noblesse oblige. Now, why is this useful to the two crises that I've outlined? I think with regard to the crisis of impossibility, placing special burdens on the most advantaged is a way to acknowledge the unfairness that persists in even the most well-ordered advanced liberal democratic regimes, and could be a way to, in some small way, remediate that sense of unfairness. And with regard to the crisis of decline and the peculiar corruption that has infected societies like the US, I think regulating the most advantaged will first of all clarify the power structure. Second of all, I think it will help motivate more ambitious reforms to reduce inequality and pursue democratic justice, such as democratizing capitalism. I think that all else equal, a society that worried more about its rich, its most advantaged, would be more likely to pursue these ambitious reforms, or some of the other reforms that Robert Post has spoken to. And I think that it is the more proper outlet for frustration, resentment, and anger in a population. It is better to vent that frustration upon those who are truly fortunate and truly able to respond to it in a practical and progressive spirit than to have it channeled against some foreign, often racialized other. I thought I was going to go well over, but thank you.
No, it's perfect.
Okay.
What's that? No, I'll just sit here. That's great. Thank you. Is this on? Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Great. So thanks to the panelists. That was really terrific. Thanks for keeping us on time. We're going to deliver half an hour for questions and answers. I'm proud of that. But I'm going to offer my own limited remarks first. I apologize that I'm going to be reading them. That's because my wife and I had a victory last night with our 9-month-old. She only woke up 3 times. Nevertheless, I think sticking to an established text is probably better than me ad-libbing at this point. So I want to begin my remarks by adopting 2 fundamental framings offered by Robert and Jeffrey, respectively. The first is that with Robert, we can't consider institutional solutions until we conceive what the problem is that we're meant to address. And that in any allegation of a crisis of democracy, a big part of the problem will be conceptual and normative inquiry into the meaning of democracy, that is, of demos and kratos, or people rule or autonomy, as part of any institutional investigation. So that's the imbrication of the normative and the institutional. The second is that with Jeffrey, we should distinguish crisis from catastrophe, a point he makes in the paper, which I recommend to you, that he didn't come out in the presentation, and recognize that crisis talk always entails a debate about whether the crisis is really happening, owing to uncertainty about whether we have passed a threshold at which, as he puts it, the subject in crisis, quote, no longer seems viable in its current form. But what is the subject of the crisis we're talking about today? The organizers have helpfully selected democracy in their title, but as I read the papers for this panel and heard the presentations, I see a much more focused concern, at least among us, on a crisis of political representation. Why and how representation in liberal democracies is broken and how it might be remade. We live, of course, in representative democracies, but again, following Robert's provocation, it's not obvious how and why our representative systems should be deemed especially democratic. Of course, it wasn't that long ago, about 2 centuries, that representation was thought fundamentally opposed to democracy. However, the marriage of the two has persisted in the intervening years. A crisis of representation is apparent in Robert's framing questions, in Arash's reimagining of the Senate through the use of the lot, in Isabelle's call for the reorganization of the firm as a bicameral economic and political body, and in Jeffrey's argument that the liberal democratic order faces a crisis not just of decline, that is, by comparisons with past realizations of the ideal, but of impossibility in realizing simultaneously central liberal aspirations. The idea of a crisis of representation comes to us, of course, from Gramsci. He introduced it as the condition in which, quote, established political parties lose an organic link to their constituencies. This generates, he argued, crises of authority and introduces a tendency towards what he called Caesarism. And this is in the late 20s, early 30s. A turn towards Caesarist politics is arguably visible today, not only in the increase in authoritarian political styles, I'm reminded of the last panel, but of course even in the rise of discretionary executive power, often rationalized on emergency grounds in established liberal democracies today. But why is there a crisis of representation? On the one hand, we face now what might be considered a recurrence of a general problem, the misfit between representation and democracy. That's to say, an organic link, as Gramsci calls it, between parties and their constituencies may always be at best contingent and fleeting, because a representation by political parties is only a proxy for or gloss on direct political action by the constituents themselves. All the panelists raised concerns that tried in one way or another to foreground forms of political engagement that do not pass through the traditional channels of representation, and I don't think that's by accident. The crisis of representation in this frame may be seen as a more general crisis of political modernity. Lacking any warrant in either a transcendent source or a thickly prescriptive account of nature's normative order, political modernity rests its legitimacy on human willing, both individual and collective. But how representation fits with this grounding remains debated in theory and contested in practice. On the modern conception of autonomy that Robert mentioned, we're supposed to give ourselves our law, but the institutional realizations of democratic will formation have proven, whether deliberately or unwittingly, elusive and fragmentary. And yet a warrant in the people's will shadows all of our inquiries into political legitimacy, even those which try to reframe the fundamental question of legitimacy as one concerning the successful delivery of desired outputs or outcomes. For that simply invites the question, whose outcomes and on whose warrant? The crisis of representation can thus be understood as a crisis of democratic will formation in societies that have used party political representation as their primary form of political self-organization, while maintaining democracy as an ultimate normative ground. Perhaps the democratic deficit, so-called, should be understood as the general shape of political modernity as such, with the crisis of representation one prominent instance of it. Now, more proximately, the crisis of representation that has stimulated many of the arguments in the papers, from Isabelle's concern about the democratization of the economy to Jeffrey's concern about economic inequality and liberalism, may be understood as a crisis of representation in political regimes that have tried to combine democratic political organization with capitalist economic organization. In the immediate years of the post-war period, the tension between democracy and capitalism was moderated by unusually high and widely shared growth, as a great deal of economic data now suggests. The political economy of these Trente Glorieuses, as they were called, helped consolidate the success of liberal democratic societies in the West and beyond. This started changing in the 1970s, for reasons I'm happy to speculate about in the questions and answers. But as Piketty's recent analysis reveals, as he's moved from the study of top incomes to bottom incomes, the bottom 50% of the US income distribution has experienced a slight decline in pre-tax real income since the mid-1970s, by contrast with relatively dramatic growth in all of their percentiles, especially at the very top. So let me repeat that in a different way. The majority of American citizens, for not just one, but now 2 generations, have been trapped at the real wages of 50 years ago, when fortunate to have maintained their employment at all. And this has occurred in a country that has otherwise enjoyed continual economic growth, while governed by parties that are increasingly seen as, if just not simply, oligarchic. The political effects of these significant trends on US domestic politics and on the US-led international order, I think, are only now being felt in earnest. If this is right, then what we're experiencing is a specific crisis of capitalism and democracy in liberal democratic states in which the agents of political representation have proved unable or unwilling to resist the neoliberal rewriting of the post-war social compact. Of course, demagogues and other manipulators will take advantage of this, but the enabling condition of their rise has been a complacency, perhaps on our part as academics, about the growing tensions in democratic capitalism itself. A few questions to get started, and then I'm going to turn over, maybe invite you all briefly to comment on the question if you want, and then we'll take a couple questions together. So for Robert, I can see how identification of a citizenry with its government may constitute a demos, one of your last claims, but how does kratos fit in? That's to say, citizenries may identify with governments in which they do not rule, but does this hegemonic formation, which does, I accept, indicate their consent to the government, but not their constituting a government, represent self-rule? If not, what more do we need beyond identifying the demos to achieve democracy? For Isabelle, accepting the need to democratize the workplace, why adopt the model of a specifically bicameral legislature? Why not push for a unicameral legislature? What special prerogatives should capital enjoy that would allow it to maintain an upper house, as it were? Why not get rid of it altogether, in that sense? For Arash, do you think ordinary citizens will identify the kind of political equality that the lot brings in as political equality, if it remains separate from agency? If not, would you want to supplement the revised bicameral representative scheme that you propose with forms of unrepresented direct political action in which political equality and political agency are linked? For example, plebiscitary politics. And I won't tell you what I think about Brexit. For Jeffrey, of the 2 constraints on the realization of liberal ideals that you identified, the unequalizing force of property and of family, do these carry equal weight in your diagnosis of the current crisis? Or are they interdependent? For example, the inequalities posed by family support may depend on inequalities in property to become pernicious. To take 2 examples we're all familiar with from the history of political thought, Plato's Callipolis, he gets rid of family and property, both, at least for the Guardian class, Thomas More's utopia, he just gets rid of private property, but he leaves families intact. On the supposition that getting rid of private property would itself transform the family in ways that would render it not pernicious. If this is right, then it maybe matters for your analysis, because the crisis of impossibility may prove less stark and closer just to the general crisis of decline, which is to say, how do we get a grip on the economy again? For all of you, a final general question concerning agency. To the extent that you identify an institutional solution, can you conceive an agent or agents required who could bring it about? Do you have a theory of transition by which we might say democratize the workplace or introduce the lot to the Canadian Senate? Is this, whether it's a renewal of parties, a revolutionary vanguard, or a Gramscian war of position among academics, usually the most self-flattering for us? Thank you. We actually have more than half an hour. I kept my remarks short, and I'm no longer a decent hire. I have to be a decent hire for a little longer. If your question's running on too long, I'll kind of signal to you, and I hope that you'll keep it. 1:15, yeah, 1:10, 1:15. Great. So I apologize. Do you guys want to start with the questions I posed, or do you want to? Maybe let's take some more, and you can. Let's get people talking. I apologize that I don't know many of your names, but we'll go from the back there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Phil Thompson.
Oh yeah, Phil. Hi.
My question is actually a follow-up to a question you just asked, and it's to Isabelle and Jeffrey. In the U.S., a lot of labor unions who have partly pensions already have 50% of the decision-making power on those pensions. We're talking trillions of dollars. But in practice, the management side really makes 90% of the decisions. And that side goes to business school where they're trained to think in a certain way and make decisions in a certain way. And my question is, where will workers go? Because I don't know, they don't go anywhere right now in order to make different kinds of decisions. And to me, it connects to what Jeffrey, a question after Jeffrey is regulation enough? Because very often workers just go along with what the management side wants, and they don't know they're being screwed, even when they are being screwed. Example, many invested in Trump business, who then evicted their members out of their houses. The largest healthcare workers union was investing in cigarettes until very recently, etc. And so it gets to your transition question. What are ways, is regulation enough, or do we need to be thinking about how to build capacities so that actually we can grow something different?
Fantastic. Yves. Would you like? Oh, here. Oh, actually, here.
I have a question for Isabelle. Could you explain us to what extent your system differs from the German co-determination system? And I have a remark for Arash. I strongly disagree with the idea that confronted to a chamber which would be randomly selected, those who are defeated on one policy would be inclined to civil war or a legal contest because they have no perspective of sizing the power. In fact, they could have the perspective of reversing the policy because of their activity in the public sphere, because of another randomly selected chamber. I don't see the difference, the main difference with, say, a court in which you can lose your case, but you can appeal and win your case in the other court. So historically, this was the case when the randomly selected bodies were implemented.
Great. And the lady next to Melissa, and then we'll pause. Sorry, I've forgotten your name. Please introduce yourselves also when you start the question. I think that was
from Columbia University. So I want to follow up with Isabelle in the sense of the bicameralism, which appears to be kind of a hot topic instead of institutionalism. But in bicameralism, there's always an upper house that has de facto veto power on the lower house. You didn't explain in your proposal who is the high camera, is the capital or is labor, or if your framework is completely different. And related to that, how does your project relate to a new thing that has come up as the public benefit companies that incorporate the welfare of the consumers, not only workers, in the charter? So it would profit would be, and all the structure of stakeholders in the corporations would be kind of subordinated to the constitutional framework. And then for Arash, I want to kind of follow up on Eve's comment. It's like I don't see how a randomly selected body would have the authority to override the decisions made by representatives who have been elected by millions of people. So I get that the lottery is a way of is a democratic procedure, but in your proposal, this would be again, it would be how would it work? Would be in kind of making a contribution to the legislative process, or having veto power over the legislative process? How would it work?
Actually, so maybe you could hold here, and then we'll start with you, and we'll just take these three plus whatever you wanted to take from my comments too. We can just start that way. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Not to make it longer, but to make it hopefully. Mie is in the room, or no? She's yes. Could you start? Oh, this is okay. It's me. So I guess my first point would be to say that ideas matter, and so to come back to your question, Phil, but other questions that have been raised, I think the most important point in my talk is, if I can get that across, is that there is a fundamental misconception about what is a firm, and we have believed actually what the economic theory of the firm has been brainwashing us somehow, which is that the firm equals the corporation, but that is not true. And there are many strands of literatures that can be assembled together, and this is part of my research endeavor, is to try to build an alternative to the economic theory of the firm, which I call a political theory of the firm. So let me just show you this. This is the monocameral type of government that we know today, which is basically to take the institutions of the corporation as really the firm. Okay, and as we switch to the idea of bicameralism, this is what it can become. And let me stress that no rights are taken from the capitalists. It's just that the same rights are accorded to labor investors. In bicameral theory,
why not?
Yeah,
that's the question.
But in bicameral theory, there is a parity of power between the two chambers, and that's part of the sort of the history of transition of those bicameral system in any country to change that dynamic, that equilibrium. But my understanding here is precisely parity between the two chambers. That's tied to the understanding of what happened in that first bicameral moment that I identify in Rome, which is 497 before Christ. It's a veto power that is given to the tribunes of the plebs before and ante to the decisions of the patricians. So it's parity, okay? It's 50 plus 1% that you need to get in each chamber. Let me give you just a sense of the transition then, because so this is, if you look at the history of industrial relations in Europe mostly, but also what happened here in the US in some important moments in the 20th century, you can get a sense that there is this quest of institutionalizing the firm beyond the corporation. That's also where the B Corp initiative is coming. But so let me just finish to say that indeed, ideally, David, it's to respond to your question. Probably, ideally, this is like on normative grounds, this would be the ideal type of firm that you want to see if you take seriously the fact that these are economic entities and that we want to have them fit in a democracy. All power goes to labor investors. But the problem is that that utopia has been part of the life of capitalism, and it exists. Some cooperatives are extremely successful, and it's very important to show that it can be successful. My point here is to say that we need transition path. Even if you want to get there, we need transition path, and that's where bicameralism can be very crucial.
Thank you. Robert, did you want to comment on anything? Right. Jeffrey.
Very, very briefly, Philip's comment. I think my proposal about regulating the most advantaged is an idea for transition. It's not the end point, but my suggestion is a way to focus reformist energies, build reformist energies, educate people about power dynamics. And so I share your sense about transition, and that's how I'm pitching this very idea of let's pay more attention to the most advantaged. And then very briefly to Dave's great question about the relationship between the family and private property as sources of unfairness. I think they are interconnected. The example of the Finnish study shows this. People are not just being wealthy is important to having opportunities, but coming from a wealthy family. I think the family is an irreducible aspect of creating outsized or disproportionate opportunities, and so I would agree with the long tradition from Plato to Rawls who would admit that. But if you're asking me to pick which one is more important given our current situation, absolutely. Economic inequality would be something that could do so much, I think, to correct some sense of unfairness and some sense of crisis, and that would trickle in as well to some of the ways that the family functions.
That's great. What's that? Oh, okay. Yes. Arash.
Right. So if I could just start with Yves' question, I think you're absolutely right that in relation to a sortition legislature, that actors in civil society would be able to mobilize in order to mobilize public opinion and so on, and organize political coalitions, and with the hope that having mobilized public opinion in a certain way, they increase their chances of individuals ending up in the decision-making body. But what that doesn't, so this kind of hinges on this hinges on some empirical claims that may be contestable. But as I see it, a sortition chamber would not have the same partisan quality as an elected chamber. And so what that means is that this kind of mobilization does not translate into the possibility for actors to for the possibility of actors to envision themselves implementing a political program of a political party within the legislature, which I think is actually key to the kind of Schwartzky argument of the peaceful conflict resolution function of elections, is that the sort of by and large non-partisan character of a sortition legislature, as I see it, and again that's a empirically contestable claim whether that would happen or not, I think means that it wouldn't serve the function, which is why I take it that you do need some kind of institutional compromise with an elected legislature. The other thing that I would say in response to authorization, that's a very good question. So I think that I'm not going to talk about it in terms of authorization for the moment. The legitimacy of the sortition chamber would derive precisely from its capacity to be able to advance some of the fundamental norms of a representative democratic society. So political equality, which an elected chamber does not do, and the counter corruption, counter to the corruption of the electoral process that occurs by powerful interests, which goes along with a more descriptively representative chamber. Those are the fundamental bases of its legitimacy, combined with the possibility of enhancing a kind of responsiveness. So I take it that is what authorizes these individuals to do it is precisely that they've been selected by a process that embodies these values. Now you might say, well, that's not authorization, and if that's the response, I suspect that what's lurking in the background is an equation of authorization with some sort of consent theory or social contract theories. In other words, elections are a way of authorizing because somehow I have voluntarily ceded to the authority through the exercise of my will in the communication of the intent to abide by and so on. And I just think that that's a mythical view about what elections are. So I don't think elections actually do that, if that's what's lurking in the background. So if it's not, then the straightforward answer is that they're authorized by the sortition process. That's how they are.
Great. Melissa?
This is another run at the bicameralism question that's directed at both Isabelle and Arash, and it follows very closely on what David and Camille have already asked. But, so if the problem that we're trying to solve, or one of the problems that we're trying to solve, is deficits of political equality or workplace equality, it's not clear to me why we do want bicameralism, which is necessarily an egalitarian insofar as it promotes a supermajority rule. Even in your example, if you imagine 51 out of 100 in one house and 51 out of 100 in the other house, you're still getting 102 out of 200, so you're building in a certain type of egalitarianism, which I think has always been intended. I think that's supposed to induce a certain form of sclerosis, or at least a slowing down of institutional change. And so I wondered if you could both articulate specifically, what is the separation into two houses actually buying us that unicameralism couldn't? I can think of a couple of possibilities. One is that there's something special about deliberation that's going to happen either in the randomly selected body or on the part of labor, and you can't have that across groups. I can see an argument like that. Although then I do have questions about authorization, but we can set those aside. Or is it a risk that the members of the randomly selected assembly or labor would in a way be captured or would be swayed in a way that would be harmful to their capacity to really articulate their claims? And if that's the problem, then I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about how these other chambers are going to be insulated from this issue.
Great. John, is it? Yes. I apologize. I have some names down. This is probably our last pass. There's a lot of interest that we'll have to carry on after during lunch. I'm sorry about that. Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to join this discussion for Isabelle as the recipient of all of these comments to raise the question of the normative question of why democracy in the firm. I agree very much with the sentiments of the drifted, and I think there are a lot of technical issues, and whether it's politically viable is another matter. But I want to just put on the table, to reinforce your argument, the early warning detection principle. You know, I was a student of C.B. Macpherson. He spent his whole life, more or less at the time as Bob Dahl, of thinking about markets and democracy. And the normative justifications were basically founded on the equality principle. You cannot have one person, one vote, but in the workplace, despotism. And you, in a way, pursue that, and I'm very sympathetic to it, but I think it needs toughening. And I want to say that the key reason why is that if you look at large-scale corporations, you look at mega projects. I have looked in detail at Lehman Brothers, TEPCO, Fukushima, and BP in the Deepwater Horizon project. And the principle, the trend is very clear. If you have no democratic accountability mechanisms built into that firm, then you will produce, in the extreme, catastrophe. This is the early warning detector system argument, and it seems to me that it's relevant because we haven't discussed in the last day one of the basic trends which every democracy is confronted with, which is the financialization of capitalism. Jürgen Kocker's great book on this shows that this is a distinctive period.
If you wouldn't mind finishing up.
One last remark.
Please.
What's dangerous about this trend, in which more than 90% of the money supply is controlled by the banking and credit sector, thereby restricting democratically elected governments, is that market failures, bubbles, are produced by the hubris of these companies. And one last historical remark. Charles Kindleberger, great German American historian, has written his great book on the history of bubbles. And what he shows is that first is the Dutch tulip craze in the early 1600s. There have been 11 major burst bubbles in the history of capitalism, and 7 have happened since 1970. The most recent is the 2070.
Thank you.
Here's a new argument for democracy.
Actually, I'd like you please to stop now.
Yeah,
That's
if
great.
you want to
Thank you.
prevent catastrophes.
I'm a decent hierarch, thank you. Great, and the last question will be Hélène. I'm sorry we don't have time for more, but in order to give our speakers a chance for final comments, we have to stop now. Thank you.
Direction to Arash more specifically. So you use the term compromise to refer to your bicameral model, but I hear something else than the meaning of compromise in Isabelle's model, for example. In her case, it's about, okay, what we have, it's realism, you know, the realist constraint, that's what's feasible now. In your case, it's not so much a compromise, I feel, as a balance, like at the theoretical level, at the ideal theoretical level of different principles of legitimacy. And so I was wondering why you phrase it in terms of compromise, and I also wonder whether instead of pitting them against each other as having different sources of legitimacy, they shouldn't have a division of labor about what they're doing. So they wouldn't be competing, but they would just be performing different things. Maybe one being agenda setter, the other sort of implementing the agenda, something like that.
Great. So concluding comments from any or all of you about any of what you've heard. So maybe we'll start, if we start with you, Arash, and then go down.
Yeah, I'm not attached to the word compromise, and maybe we'll talk about what the best way to characterize it is. You're right. It's not a compromise with reality in the sense that in the ideal case we could do better. It's sort of, as you say, it's a compromise between different values, and maybe balance is the right word. I'm not sure how to put it. I don't think it's something that we could overcome. Is another way to put this. So in terms of what. Just coming to Melissa's question about bicameralism. So this is a worry that I do have about bicameralism, is precisely that the possibility of allowing minorities that are powerful to sort of be able to stop political action on the part of so there's a kind of balance that I think is involved here, and it's a balance between different kinds of values. So given that I don't think that you can get rid of an electoral chamber for the purpose of representative democracy, the question is, how can you enhance the power of precisely the less privileged in society? And I take that to be part of the function of having a sortition chamber. Now, why, for example, make it bicameral as opposed to having a unicameral where you have different kinds of representatives? I think you're exactly pointing in the direction that I would go, which is that I think that so this isn't the only function of having these two chambers. One is what I just said, but the other one is that I think that a randomly selected assembly, precisely because it doesn't have an electoral imperative, and therefore would be less partisan. There's a whole set of different things. There's less strategic considerations that are going to be driving the nature of the internal deliberations of the chamber. It does perform a deliberative function that I think is part of the justification for bicameralism, actually. So that's kind of where I would go with it. But yeah, I think you're right. It's a genuine worry. So there's a kind of compromise or balance. I don't know.
Terrific.
I would just underline that when I mentioned the earlier thinkers in popular republicanism who seem to acknowledge as just a point of fact, inescapable fact, that there would be an overlap of economic and political power, thinkers like Harrington, Montesquieu, and Madison, I think that we should follow their descriptive honesty, but we have to have a slightly different tonality and mentality from theirs. There's complexity in their views, but to some degree, they were sanguine about the overlap of political and economic power, and that's not at all what I'm advocating. And I think that, furthermore, I don't think confronting the overlap of political and economic power has to mean feeling extremely depressed about the future of democracy. I think that we live in an age where there are many liberal democratic states that are achieving something like, you could argue, the highest types of liberal democracies ever existed. And as political theorists, we have an interest in the best regime, and it's not here. But I think that if we focus on the Northern European countries, for example, and say, how could they, 50 years from now, be even more democratic? I would suggest that one way they could do so is by facing this shadow of unfairness, facing the overlap of economic and political power, and in so doing, worry more than they do about the most advantaged class. Regulating the most advantaged is not only a way for a crisis-ridden declining democratic culture to right itself, but it's a way for an already successful, relatively speaking, democratic regime to achieve still new heights in democratization.
So one way to understand the crisis that seems to be motivating many people in this room is that people have lost control of their lives and their work due to globalization of capital, and they spend most of their lives in a work situation which is hopeless for them. And Isabelle's solution is to have a bicameral firm in which labor and capital equally cover. But that just deflects the problem, which is, why would the labor representatives be viewed as making the life of the worker better? That just defers the issue of what David called representation now to the level of the firm instead of the polity. So it brings us back to our problem, which is on the table, which is, why do people want to have the sense of representation, this notion of authority resting on human will, which is what we seem to have left, as David said. And the larger issue, I think, as Larry Lessig in this room has written about many times, is that we feel that our politics is controlled by forms of capital, forms of investment, over which we have no influence. That's a different diagnosis than penalizing the wealthy. That's a different diagnosis than saying things are unequal and they should be more equal. I think, all things considered, of course they should be more equal, but that's a different question than they're not democratic. They're not democratic is it's out of our control, and therefore I don't feel represented by them. It's a question of agency, as opposed to a more just society, which is more egalitarian. So I would just separate these questions. I think they lead to different solutions because they're diagnosing different problems. And on this question of the sortition, I think it brings us back to the same problem again, namely, why would I care that they're randomly chosen? In what sense do they represent me? This is Jenny Mansford's notion of descriptive representation. Well, there have to be a lot of preconditions before descriptive representation actually actually works for me, that they are like me because they're random. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of random people, and why would they have any political? You need an account of that. And we need to face this question of what is the form of agency that's going to solve the democratic problem, as opposed to the inequality problem or the unequal power problem, which are separate problems and require different solutions. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all these inputs, and of course I'm not going to address all of them. I think more about them, but let me just say about 3 points. First, I understand that for political theories to come with bicameralism might seem, when we speak about, when we worry about the crisis of democracy, it might seem like a very old-fashioned solution, and that doesn't seem very sort of attractive or innovative. I guess that speaks for how backward is the situation in firms, in our economic realm of life. And as you think more about political history, the fact that by the first bicameral moment we can trace 25 centuries ago, well, that speaks for, if we are only putting the firm on the course of this democratic transition now, well, it's it's insightful to look at how we've done it in the past, and that reflects the very basic, crude situation that we face in the firm in terms of how the power is handled today. In terms of the scheme in itself, I think my understanding is that it would be very adverse to the conditions of efficiency for a firm to convene these two chambers separately. I think that's part of the sort of information and intelligence gathering point that has been one of the arguments that Arash reminded us for bicameralism, is that these two firms are going to make the decisions of the entity smarter. And that's important that in that sense, they are not used for the executive management to tell a different story to the two chambers. And that's kind of to this question. Let me just, let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Let me just say one thing, sorry.